In August 2001, off the coast of New Jersey, a bizarre scene unfolded right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Massive cranes lifted old New York City subway cars off a barge, one by one, and dropped them into the deep sea in a matter of seconds. Each 20-ton car vanished completely beneath the dark blue water. News spread fast, and the public's reaction was pretty much unanimous. New York was turning the ocean into a dumping ground, and it wasn't just a few cars, it was thousands of them. Over the next 9 years, a total of about 2,580 subway cars would be sunk along the coastlines of several U.S. states. Everyone figured these giant steel blocks would just sit there rotting on the seafloor. But years later, when biologists went back to check on them, what they saw completely flipped how they thought about ocean restoration. Thousands of subway cars suddenly become a problem in the late 1990s. The New York City subway system was gearing up for its biggest overhaul in decades. New trains with modern tech were rolling in, which meant thousands of old cars had to be retired. The most iconic of the bunch was the Redbird series, those red-painted cars that had been a familiar sight to millions of New Yorkers for over 30 years. Every single day, they navigated hundreds of miles of underground tunnels, carrying workers to their jobs, kids to school, and tourists exploring one of the busiest cities in the world. But like any machine, after decades of non-stop operation, it was time for them to step aside for the new generation. This created an unprecedented headache for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or the MTA. What do you do with thousands of subway cars that weigh nearly 20 tons apiece? Just moving them out of the rail yards was a massive logistical nightmare. If they went with traditional scrapping, every single car would have to be chopped up, the metals sorted, and then shipped off to recycling plants. This entire process wouldn't just eat up a ton of time, it would cost tens of millions of dollars. With over 2,000 cars to deal with, it was basically a budget nightmare. The vast majority of these Redbirds were built out of carbon steel, an incredibly tough material strong enough to withstand near constant use for decades. Plus, in the later stages of the program, there were also some R32 Brightliner cars thrown into the mix, which were made of stainless steel. Despite the different materials, they had one thing in common: they were built to survive the brutal environment of the NYC transit system. Because of that, completely destroying these massive steel blocks wasn't nearly as simple as people thought. While the MTA was racking their brains for a solution, hundreds of miles away under the Atlantic Ocean, a totally different problem was unfolding. Many offshore areas along coastal states like New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland were nothing but endless stretches of flat, barren sand. To humans, that might just look like normal seafloor. But to marine biologists, it was an incredibly impoverished ecosystem. Unlike natural rocky reefs or coral reefs, a sandy bottom offers practically zero hard surfaces for marine organisms to latch onto. Species like oysters, blue mussels, sponges, and soft corals all need a stable foundation to grow. Without that foundation, the entire food chain sitting above it takes a massive hit. Fish have fewer places to hide, fewer places to breed, and their populations slowly decline over time. That's when a seemingly crazy idea started to float around. If these old subway cars were useless on land, why not give them a second life at the bottom of the ocean? To a lot of biologists, the shape of the cars didn't matter. What mattered was that these massive chunks of steel could provide exactly what the seafloor was desperately missing: a hard structure in the middle of miles of flat sand. As long as there's a stable surface, the tiniest organisms will find their way to it. After that, nature just does the rest. This idea quickly caught the attention of several states along the Atlantic coast. For a long time, these states had been running programs to build artificial reefs using old ships, concrete bridges, or massive boulders. But this time, instead of sinking a single ship or a few concrete slabs, They were looking at the opportunity to use thousands of decommissioned subway cars. If it worked, it would become one of the largest artificial reef projects ever pulled off in the United States. On paper, this sounded like the perfect win-win. New York solves its massive scrap disposal headache. Coastal states get hundreds of new structures to jumpstart their underwater ecosystems. And scientists get a chance to test a hypothesis that had never been tried on a scale this massive before. But as soon as the plan went public, not everyone was convinced it was a smart move. To a lot of people, dragging thousands of subway cars out into the ocean had only one name: turning the sea into a landfill. And that was just the spark for a much bigger controversy to come. The biggest controversy wasn't about the steel. If the story ended with the idea, this probably would have gone down as one of the most straightforward recycling projects in U.S. history. But reality played out completely differently. The moment the plan to sink the first batch of subway cars was announced, intense backlash basically exploded across the Atlantic states. For a lot of people, it was really hard to swallow the idea that the government was actively dumping thousands of old train cars into the ocean and trying to spin it as an environmental conservation project. Headlines at the time were full of sarcastic phrases, calling it ocean dumping or turning the seafloor into a NYC subway graveyard. In the eyes of the public, there wasn't much of a difference between sinking thousands of subway cars and just dumping thousands of tons of scrap metal into the sea. That skepticism wasn't exactly baseless. For decades prior, the ocean had repeatedly been treated as a dumping ground for stuff humans no longer wanted, from industrial waste and construction debris to toxic chemicals. Plenty of projects were pitched as safe, only to leave a mess that lasted for decades. So, when people heard New York was gearing up to sink over 2,000 subway cars, their first reaction wasn't curiosity. It was sheer panic. If these cars were still coated in grease, industrial paint, or toxic materials, the whole project could easily turn into an environmental disaster right at the bottom of the Atlantic. Actually, the thing that environmental groups pushed back on the hardest wasn't the steel framing of the cars. Steel is a relatively stable material in seawater and has been used to build various types of artificial reefs for a long time. What really had them concerned were the hidden components inside every single car. After decades of service, the Redbirds were still packed with technical materials like lubricating oils, electrical wiring, plastic and rubber parts, insulation, and most notably, asbestos, a material highly popular in mid-20th century transit for its fireproofing qualities. By the early 2000s, the severe health risks of asbestos were well documented, so even a tiny leftover trace was enough for many environmental orgs to demand the entire project be shut down. The state of New Jersey saw the fiercest debate. Some local environmental groups argued that if the prep work wasn't handled with absolute perfection, hazardous materials could leach into the marine environment for years to come. They demanded that every single car be inspected individually, rather than just approving them in massive batches. Public pressure was so intense that the project organizers had to prove they weren't just looking for a cheap garbage disposal hack, but were genuinely executing a well-researched method to restore marine ecosystems. Because of this, before any car was allowed to leave the rail yard, it had to go through an incredibly strict multi-day cleaning protocol. Every potentially polluting component was systematically stripped. Seats, doors, glass, wheels, wiring, grease, mechanical gear, and absolutely all asbestos-containing materials were completely ripped out. When the job was done, what was left was basically just a hollow steel shell. In other words, the cars getting ready to take a dive were no longer functional transit vehicles. They were just metal skeletons kept around for one single purpose, giving marine life a hard surface to latch onto. Even after they were scrubbed clean, they couldn't just be sunk right away. Each batch of cars had to pass a gauntlet of inspections and approvals from state and federal environmental agencies, working closely with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to guarantee they checked every single box for artificial reef standards. Only when they cleared all these hurdles were the cars loaded onto barges and towed out to pre-surveyed drop zones off the coasts of New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. By then, almost all the safety questions had been answered on paper. The engineers were confident they had eliminated every controllable risk. The biologists believed the steel structures would kickstart an explosion of life. But there was still one question no lab could answer in advance. Once they hit the ocean floor, would the ocean actually accept these massive steel blocks? Or would they just sit there forever like forgotten scrap metal at the bottom of the Atlantic? The first things to take over the cars weren't fish. When the first batch of subway cars was plunged into the Atlantic in 2001, no one expected to see major changes in just a few months. In most people's minds, these 20-ton steel blocks would just sit paralyzed in the cold water, slowly corroding from the sea salt until they were nothing but lifeless wrecks. Even many biologists assumed it would take years before they could call the project a success or a failure. So, when research teams headed back to survey the very first artificial reefs, all they were really looking to do was check if the structures were still standing stable. The underwater scene was pretty desolate at first. The cars sat tilted on the sand, windows blown wide open, passenger cabins pitch black with only a faint glimmer of light filtering down from the surface. From a distance, they looked more like a ghost train abandoned in a giant desert of sand than an actual part of the ocean. There were no brightly colored corals, no dense schools of fish like everyone pictured. If you just took a quick glance, it would have been super easy to conclude that the project hadn't made any real difference at all. But nature rarely works on a timeline that humans can see right away. The very first change happened on a microscopic level so small the human eye couldn't even catch it. After just a short stint soaking in seawater, the steel surfaces of the cars were coated in a razor-thin biofilm made of marine bacteria and microbes. It's the first step in a process biologists call biofouling, when tiny organisms attach themselves to a brand new surface introduced into an aquatic environment. That nearly invisible film was actually way more crucial than it looked. It turned slick, smooth steel into a textured surface that could trap nutrients and lay down the welcome mat for larger organisms to anchor onto. Next came marine algae, blooming into green and brown patches across the sides of the cars. Then, barnacles started encrusting the edges of the steel frames. Blue mussels, oysters, and sponges quickly followed suit, clinging tightly to every beam, window ledge, and even the ceilings of the subway cars. In just a matter of months, these cold steel walls stopped looking like industrial machines. They started blending in as a natural part of the ocean floor. And that was just the opening act. As the crust of life grew thicker, larger animals quickly realized this spot gave them an edge they simply couldn't find in the barren, sandy flats around them. The first crabs rolled in, squeezing through doorways and gaps under the cars to hide from predators. Lobsters staked their claim on the dark voids underneath the frames, using them as daytime bunkers. Schools of small fish started showing up too, not because the cars themselves were food, but because the growing buffet of tiny critters made it a prime hunting ground. The arrival of those small fish is exactly what drew in the heavy hitters. Researchers began logging black sea bass, tautog, summer flounder, and a ton of other commercially valuable fish cruising around the cars. They used the aisles, doorways, and windows exactly like natural rock crevices, perfect for ambushing prey and ducking out of the punishing currents of the open water. Instead of aimlessly wandering a massive sandy plain, they now had an entire steel maze to hide in. Biologists weren't really shocked that fish showed up. They had already predicted that. What actually blew their minds was the speed of the whole process, in a fraction of the time forecasted by their models. These completely lifeless train cars had become the beating heart of an incredibly fast-growing biological community. Every new species that moved in rolled out the red carpet for the next one, just like a chain of falling dominoes. Nobody was out there stocking the fish. Nobody was planting corals. The ocean did everything totally on its own terms. Just as long as it finally got the one thing it had been missing for years, a solid enough foundation for life to start. As the surveys kept rolling year after year, scientists began to realize they weren't really looking at subway cars anymore. They were witnessing the birth of a totally new ecosystem, one that was vastly larger and way more complex than anything they imagined when the project first launched. The rest of the story was about to blow even their most optimistic early expectations out of the water. An underwater city springs to life just a few years after the first subway cars took the plunge. Research teams went back and could barely even recognize the sites they originally surveyed. The cold steel blocks that once sat completely isolated on the sand were now engulfed by countless forms of marine life. The once dull, gray steel was practically invisible under dense, thriving mats of oysters, blue mussels, sponges, and soft corals. If you didn't know the history of this place, it would be almost impossible to believe that underneath all that life were the exact same subway cars that used to haul millions of people through the jam-packed tunnels of NYC. The fascinating part is that the cars themselves don't produce food. They don't pump out oxygen or nutrients for the ocean either. Their ultimate value lies entirely in their physical shape. While most of the Atlantic seafloor is just miles and miles of flat, featureless sand, every single car brings dozens of empty compartments, windows, aisles, ceilings, and countless crevices of all different sizes to the table. To humans, it's just the standard layout of a transit vehicle. But to marine animals, it's basically a multi-story apartment complex popping up in the middle of a barren wasteland. The tiniest species were the very first tenants. Crustaceans, marine worms, and invertebrates maxed out every little crack they could find to dodge strong currents and hungry predators. Next came the crabs and lobsters guys who were always on the hunt for dark, enclosed spaces to crash in during the day. They took over the undercarriages, the blind spots under the steel frames, and the empty voids left by removed wheels. As bottom dwellers multiplied, the local food buffet expanded massively, laying the groundwork for a huge variety of fish to move in. That's when the chain reaction truly shifted into high gear. Schools of smaller fish showed up first, swimming around the windows and aisles to scavenge while steering clear of the exposed. Open water. Shortly after, bigger predators like black sea bass, tautog, and summer flounder came cruising in. They didn't just come to hunt, they completely weaponized the structure of the cars as natural ambush spots. Every new species that joined the party added another link to the food chain, and the entire ecosystem started functioning almost exactly like a natural rocky reef. This perfectly explains why biologists stopped calling them subway cars. In scientific reports, they were officially recognized as components of an artificial reef. That term doesn't mean humans magically grew coral, it means humans dropped the foundation so nature could build the rest. Once the base layer is there, every link in the ecosystem naturally gravitates to it without us having to lift another finger. This shift wasn't just tracked on clipboards by scientists. The very first people to notice the real-world difference were actually local fishermen. They started finding that areas which used to be dead zones were suddenly turning into highly reliable fishing hotspots. Fish density around the artificial reefs spiked noticeably compared to the sandy flats nearby. Meanwhile, scuba divers were capturing absolutely mind-blowing footage schools of fish swimming straight through train doors, lobsters tucked away under where seats used to be years ago, and thick blankets of sponges and soft corals covering the train roofs as if they'd been sitting there for decades. That massive early success caused the program to rapidly expand. Instead of just dumping them off the coast of New Jersey, cars were shipped out to several other states down the Atlantic coastline, including Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Over a span of 9 years, from 2001 to 2010, roughly 2,580 subway cars were systematically sunk at pre-surveyed locations, spawning hundreds of new artificial reef clusters. It went down as one of the largest large-scale transit vehicle repurposing programs ever executed for marine restoration in the U.S. by that point. Even the biggest skeptics had to admit the project was delivering results way beyond what anyone originally hoped for. However, as scientists continued to monitor these artificial reefs in the years that followed, they stumbled onto a detail that was even more surprising. The most remarkable takeaway wasn't the sheer volume of fish, nor the insanely fast recovery of the ecosystem. It actually had to do with the very materials used to build the cars in the first place. It was an outcome that even the engineers who designed them decades ago never saw coming. What even the engineers didn't see coming. By the time the program officially wrapped up in April 2010, about 2,580 subway cars were resting peacefully at the bottom of the Atlantic. For the MTA, it was basically mission accomplished. Thousands of retired cars were no longer clogging up rail yards, and disposal costs were drastically slashed compared to the traditional scrapping route. But for marine biologists, this was just the starting line. They kept going back to the artificial reefs for years afterward to track how these structures would evolve over time. And it was those exact long-term surveys that led to a discovery the original train engineers could never have predicted. At first, plenty of people assumed the stainless steel cars would be the ones to survive the longest underwater. It made total sense. Up on land, stainless steel is famous for fighting off corrosion way better than carbon steel. Conventional wisdom said a heavily rust-resistant material should easily outlast the others in a highly salty marine environment. But reality at the bottom of the Atlantic didn't play out quite that simply. After years of observation, researchers noticed that most of the carbon steel redbirds were actually holding their shape pretty well. Sure, they were still corroding over time, but the pace was much slower than initially forecasted. Meanwhile, some of the R32 Brightliner cars, the stainless steel ones, dropped late in the program, were degrading faster than expected in certain spots. The culprit wasn't just the material itself, it came down to the structural design. The joints, galvanic corrosion between mismatched metals, and the constant, punishing battering of ocean currents. It was a stark reminder to engineers of a classic rule in materials science: a structure's real-world durability doesn't just ride on the name of the material, but on the exact environment it's forced to survive in year after year. To the marine biologists, however, the much more fascinating takeaway was something entirely different. While engineers were sweating over how long a car would last, nature didn't seem to give a damn. The ocean doesn't care if it's carbon steel or stainless steel. All life really needs is a surface hard enough to grab onto. That's exactly what made the whole project so incredible. The very first organisms didn't care what the car used to do. They had no idea it was a vehicle that hauled millions of daily commuters beneath the streets of Manhattan. They had no clue humans spent months fiercely debating whether or not to sink them. To marine bacteria, a steel beam is just a place to stick. To oysters and blue mussels, it's a stable foundation. To crabs and lobsters, it's a safe house to hide from predators. And to massive schools of fish, it's a brand new rocky reef magically appearing in the middle of a vast, empty ocean of sand. That's honestly the coolest part of this entire story. Humans spend so much time debating whether an object is worthless or not. We judge everything based on its original function. If a train car can't carry passengers anymore, it's labeled scrap metal. But nature judges by a totally different standard. An object is only truly useless when it can no longer serve any form of life whatsoever. If it can still act as a shelter, a breeding ground, or simply a flat surface for the very first organisms to latch onto, its life cycle is nowhere near over. Today, if you dive down to those artificial reefs off New Jersey, Delaware, or Virginia, you can still easily make out the rectangular window frames, the sliding doors, or the iconic steel skeletons of the NYC subway. But they aren't the focal point of the scenery anymore. What truly steals the show are the layers upon layers of marine life coating every single surface. Sponges grow thick on the roofs of the cars. Blue mussels and oysters plaster the steel walls. Soft corals sway effortlessly in the ocean currents. Schools of black sea bass cruise through windows that once looked out onto crowded Manhattan platforms, while lobsters quietly tuck themselves away in the undercarriages. Those trains were originally built to carry humans through a city that never sleeps. Nobody ever thought that after their time on land ran out, they would kick off a completely different journey at the bottom of the ocean. They aren't hauling passengers anymore. Instead, they are quietly supporting millions of marine creatures every single day, becoming living proof that sometimes what nature needs isn't complex engineering or insanely expensive tech, but simply a solid enough foundation to find its own way back. Looking back at the entire project, the most mind-blowing part isn't the fact that over 2,000 subway cars were dumped into the sea. It's exactly how nature responded to them. What humans viewed as junk, the ocean saw as a foundation for life. As long as there's a solid surface, bacteria, algae, oysters, sponges, and eventually fish and lobsters will show up entirely on their own, step by step building out a massive ecosystem without anyone having to assemble it for them. Of course, this isn't a free pass to just toss anything and everything into the sea. The project's success was only possible thanks to rigorous cleaning protocols, careful site selection, and years of hardcore scientific research. When science and nature are working together the right way, an object that seems totally worthless can still kick off a completely brand new life cycle. Maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this whole story. Sometimes, nature doesn't need miracles, it just needs a fighting chance. And at the bottom of the Atlantic, the very same trains that once carried millions of passengers are still out there, silently proving that truth every single day.